Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by SS&C Blue Prism. Agentic automation isn't just the next step in automation, it's the future of how work gets done. By enabling intelligent, autonomous agents to take action, adapt, and collaborate, organizations are unlocking new levels of productivity, growth, and customer delight. Join us as we explore how agentic automation is reshaping work for the better, for customers, employees, shareholders, and most importantly, you. To stay on top of the hottest topics in the world of agentic automation, subscribe now. Let's get into the show.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Transform Now. I'm your host, Michael Marchuk, and today I have a guest that I have been waiting to chat with. We'll be talking with Jacob Ward, a man who spent more time predicting the future than most of us spend doom scrolling through it. He's been a correspondent for Al Jazeera, CNN, PBS, and NBC News, which means he's seen more geopolitical chaos than your average Bond villain. And he's the author of The Loop, a book that warned us about AI before it became our therapist, our boss, and most recently our best friend. Jacob also co-wrote and hosted Hacking Your Mind, a PBS documentary that predicted the rise of Donald Trump, which is either a triumph of journalism or a terrifying flex. He was the editor-in-chief of Popular Science, which means he's probably read more about quantum physics than most of us have read IKEA instructions. And if that wasn't enough, he's written for The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, and Wired, proving that he can explain the end of civilization in prose so elegant, you'll almost enjoy it. So buckle up. If anything, we're going to have a great conversation. Welcome, Jacob.
Michael, that is the best bio I've ever gotten. That's damn good. I'm going to crib a lot of that. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
My pleasure. Well, again, you have a varied background, and tell us a little bit more about yourself. From what I had gone through, I was basically the bio that I was able to pull from about you, but you've got a deep history in a bunch of different things. Maybe you can tell it in your own words.
Yeah, sure. So, the broad theme of it is that I'm a very sunny and optimistic person in a lot of ways. Like my take on just the fact of human civilization is incredibly upbeat. I just think it's a total miracle that we get on the freeway every day and don't bang into each other on the highway, the second we try to merge. The fact that we have built all of this stuff, these clothes and this shelter and these systems of justice is a testament to just the amazingness of humanity. So that's my base from which I then have built this career looking at the ways in which technology winds up sort of pulling us out past our depths, right? We are built, our circuitry, our social networks, our, inborn systems are built for a certain set of optimized functions. And that typically has to do with like not getting tricked by strangers and finding food really conveniently and easily and not wasting a lot of time or energy making decisions. And the theme of the last few, more than a decade now of my work has been looking at the ways in which technology is increasingly playing on those inborn systems. So I spend a huge amount of time in Hacking Your Mind and then in The Loop thinking about how it is that we are uniquely vulnerable, how our circuitry makes us uniquely vulnerable to systems that pretend to be able to make choices for us like AI, and why it is that as human beings, we're also very, very, allergic culturally, socially, psychologically to admitting things, that we are powerless over, our unconscious choices. This is true in addiction. It's true in being manipulated by other people. And so for me, whether it was at Al Jazeera or NBC or my magazine writing, it's always been trying to sort of focus on basically a thing that a guy, an elder at Wired, a guy named Kevin Kelly used to say all the time, which was, what is the technology trying to tell us, right? What's it trying to reveal to us about ourselves? And that's really been my guiding star.
And so I would boil that down to run. Right?
It's dark. I can ruin a lot of parties. I definitely I was at a party once and was doing my ranty spiel with somebody, and at the end of it, she looked at me with her head kind of sideways, and she was like, that was very dark, but very upbeat. I enjoyed that. Thank you. And then she walked away. And I remember thinking, oh, that's how I am. Yeah. So.
Well, yeah, so start off with in The Loop, you start talking about how we're taking AI and we're basically embedding our own worst instincts into AI, essentially turning it a mirror of our own flaws. So if we're all so predictably dumb, as you kind of mentioned through this, and we're racing to create these super intelligent systems that mirror us, how intelligent could they actually be?
Yeah. So the way I think about it is, so I spend a huge amount of time in the book talking about the unconscious decision-making systems that we have. And I think anybody out there can probably relate to the notion of, when you drive from, your home to a place you always go, whether it's your office or dropping your kids at school or the grocery store, right? You can do it sometimes on automatic pilot. Like you'll get there without even not even realizing you were turning the wheel and working the brake and avoiding other death machines on the road, right? Like you don't even think about it because your brain is like, I know this story. I know how this one goes. So I'll take it from here. You don't have to be consciously aware of this. I got it, right? And your brain basically wants to do that all the time. That is its gift. It's why we are all here together, is because those instinctive systems have been driving the car so much of our waking lives. And so the thing with AI is, so the thing about those systems is that they are incredibly predictable. The last 50 years of behavioral science have shown that there are these really specific patterns that people fall into, especially when you starve them of adequate amounts of time or adequate information. We just make these assumptions because our brains, again, are just like machines that just go, I got it, I got this one, I know this one. And so the problem with AI, as I see it, and what inspired me to write this book, was that it's going to give people who want to sell you stuff or change your behavior in some way to their advantage a way of reading the patterns in behavior that AI makes possible, right? It can look at huge amounts of data and boil some signal out of that data, and will wind up feeding those patterns back at us as, funny videos on your social media, right? Or the most convincing kind of political writing anyone's ever come up with, which study after study is showing these systems can create, right? They are able to, or a beautiful piece of music that you find very moving and captivating, right? These systems, it turns out we are much easier to simulate and manipulate than we might have thought. And so I think there is enormous capacity. I mean, one of the weird things about my book is that a lot of it is based on work inspired by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning economist who with Amos Tversky wrote this series of really pioneering papers in the 70s. He wrote this book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which many of your listeners will probably know. And what's funny is like halfway through writing my book, he wrote a book, he co-authored a book about how he thought AI could actually be useful to improve what he calls our slow thinking, our ability to be cautious and rational and so forth. And I remember reading that and being like, oh man, I was so bummed because my whole thesis was based on the kind of work that he had and others like him had been doing. It was clear that the market is going to try to make our fast thinking brain drive the car. And it doesn't work to their market advantage if you get the slow thinking brain involved. And he was saying, oh, AI can improve the slow thinking brain. And I think that is probably true. But if you want to make money off somebody, having them distracted, having them fall into their unconscious habits, that's the best way to get them to do what you want. And so while I think AI could create a super intelligent kind of, use, we can get into the question about whether the AGI is ever going to be a thing. I don't believe it is. But that feeling of, yeah, we could make ourselves better through this. We absolutely could, but is the market going to reward that? And as a result, our company's going to go after that.
So you mentioned the whole AGI thing just recently. I don't know if it was yesterday, the day before. Elon Musk is predicting that his Grok 5 is going to reach superintelligence AGI or potentially AGI as it's released next year. And I think Sam Altman was saying something similar about OpenAI's, ChatGPT 6 as they could get towards that it's becoming to that point. Obviously, there's such massive horsepower being thrown at these things. It's, I guess, possible that they could achieve something like that. But in my mind, that superintelligence is going to suck us dry energy-wise before we actually get there. But what are your thoughts on we start talking about building these biases or these thoughts or this capability of um, using our that fast and slow thinking to manipulate us in ways where you have society as a whole now. I mean, if we took a snapshot of time in our current day and age and maybe fed it back to someone 100 years ago,
Yeah.
to see that what we do on a daily basis, how we tolerate the specific type of speech that we are very accustomed to, both from a political standpoint, but just from a Facebook standpoint. Um, how do you see that working into the way that, as you kind of mentioned, AGI could lull us back to sleep again?
Hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, the theme for me of the last, few hundred years. So, right. This system one, system two thinking that we've been talking about, the fast thinking and slow thinking brain. The fast thinking brain, the one that makes the unconscious decisions, that says, I know this story and I'm going to I'm going to drive the car from here to the school without consulting you. That system is millions of years old, right? The estimate is that, because our evolutionary roots go back to intersect with primates, that it's that intersection that we have we have these systems in common with primates and even some monkeys. So that kind of in group, out group, who's my friend, who's my not kind of, gut feeling decision making, we have that in common with a lot of these mammal cousins. So that means that that system is really old and really established as a result, right? That's a piece of software that has been through a huge amount of testing. That's been debugged hard. The new part of our brains, right? The one that 70 to 100,000 years ago got some group of us to sit up, in Africa and say, in what is now Africa, and say, I wonder what else is out in the world, right? And wander beyond the moment to moment survival and say, with this new meat eating brain, I'm going to go, wander off and figure out what's over the horizon. That part of our brain that thinks about justice and creativity and what happens after we die. And let me tell you the dream I had last night, that kind of brain, the part that we like to think is our best selves and our most human selves, is very new. That's like, it's like I say, it's only about 100,000 years old, maybe. And so, excuse me, for me, that primitive brain is so much is the really predictable one. That's the one that you really, if you're trying to figure out human behavior. I mean, I literally, half the time when I speak to people who are familiar with the kind of work that I'm describing, they are in marketing. They're not wringing their hands as a journalist the way I do. They are in the business of trying to get people to do stuff and trying to get people interested in a product for a certain reason. And so they're interested in that circuitry as a form of persuasion, right? And so for me, I constantly hear people at the tops of the big AI companies talking about, we're going to unleash a new flourishing of human creativity because we're going to sort of create this little gap between your established skills and the creative ideas you have. And my problem is that, like, the neuroplasticity studies all show that, like, the more you get habitualized into a thing, the more you are treading a path in concrete. And the more that we say, oh, you know what, I don't think I'm going to actually be the one to make this moral or creative or social judgment. I'm going to instead ask this piece of software to, you know, choose who I'm going to hire or fire or write my wedding vows, or tell me what to say on a first date. The less we're going to have the capacity to do it. And the more I worry, we're going to be pushed back into a more primitive version of ourselves. And, and the problem is, right, the sort of the libertarian idea that the market will figure out what's worth keeping and discard the rest. I just worry is not going to, I don't think it's going to reward us for being the best version of ourselves. I think it's going to reward the companies that learn to focus on the most primitive version of ourselves. And so collectively as a whole, I worry that will just drag us backwards in a way we're not going to like.
Gotcha. Well, while you were talking, my brain instantly connected to movies. I usually connect to movies in one way or another as reference points in my life. And two things you brought up. One, Idiocracy came to mind in
Yeah.
terms of
Yep.
the movie thought process of, the transformation of the way we think to the way the future us globally
Yep.
thinks, as a potential. The other was Ex Machina, with potentially with this AGI becoming crafty enough to be able to exploit the fact that it's very easy to manipulate us. And,
Hmm.
perhaps we're in a point now where, all these safeguards and whatnot that we're putting in place, maybe they're going to help, maybe they're not. But I think behind all of it, there is the mechanisms, as you mentioned, we're building this tool because that's what we want. I
Hmm.
want somebody, I want to have this telling me what to do. I want it to be. So if we're desiring that, I don't think any kinds of, guardrails there are going to really protect us if we're truly desirous of that. I mean, just look at the illegal drug trade, right? If people want to get stoned, they're going to get stoned. It's just the reality. But if we're looking at these kind of tools that we're building, um, you know, whose responsibility is it then in your mind when you start talking about this? We have, our government team, people who are looking into this very deeply and trying to figure out, first of all, how they can leverage it themselves, but also how to apparently protect others with some governance laws to be able to, protect the general populace. But corporations, when we start looking at them, should we look to them to protect us, or is it really back to us in some kind of agency of our own?
Well, one thing I do, so I do a little bit of advisory work as a kind of recovering journalist now, where I go into a handful. There's a handful of companies that have come to me to say, we're interested in trying to be on the right side of history with this stuff. We want to, and sometimes it's a very just, sometimes it's a purely pragmatic decision where they're just saying, we want to avoid risk, or we want to, we want to avoid being cast as the bad guy in some big New York Times report, or whatever. But regardless, you can go in and whether it's for pragmatic reasons or for ideological reasons, nobody wants to get this wrong, I think. And so at the corporate level, I when I talk to folks like that, I do an exercise with them where I lead them through a little thing about, it's a thing I used to do with domain experts as a journalist as well, where I would say, it's called the supervillain exercise. So imagine you know what you know, and you have the resources at your disposal. You've got the product you've built, you've got all this stuff, right? And you have suddenly like a head injury that makes you evil. And you decide you're going to do as much damage with this as you can in the world. You're going to screw up people's relationships and screw up their trust in reality, and just destabilize society. What would you do to do that, right? And we walk through the little exercise for that. And it's a special kind of person who wants to play that game. But then out of that, what you say is, okay, well, great. What other than your good intentions right now just keep your company from doing that, right? What processes do you have in place? What do you have? Show me what's written down, and how do we write some things down to make it the case that if you're not in charge anymore with your good intentions, or if you change your mind in a few years, that you don't suddenly become that person, or this company doesn't become that company. I don't think so. I think there's an internal governance structure that I really hope companies can take seriously, because I think this is one of the only times in history that something as utterly transformative as AI is almost entirely held inside the private sector, inside private for-profit companies, right? The internet came out of government research. Most great breakthroughs in the past that have really had a transformative effect on society have in some way started with that sort of thing, with a public funding model. We're not there anymore. So companies suddenly have this like civic responsibility that they never had in the past. I also think, though, that we're going to require a very new way, especially in the United States, way of thinking about how what we want to protect about human agency and human society. It is our tendency in the United States to believe that everybody is their own cowboy, right? That we're alone on the prairie. It's our
Rugged
bootstraps that got us here.
individualism, right?
Rugged individualism, right? Exactly. We all want to be Han Solo, who makes his way through the minefield, the asteroid belt, with, going with his gut and tells C-3PO to shut up, right? But we're going to need to start instead realizing how predictable and vulnerable our brains are, and start enshrining, I think, some rights around being free of manipulation in the same way that we have enshrined some rights around not inhaling secondhand smoke, right? Or not subjecting your kids to sports gambling. Like there are things we've come up with that we've said, you know what, that our brains can't quite handle this level of manipulation, chemical, psychological, whatever it is. And we've put in some safeguards around that. There's a great thinker on this at Duke Law School named Nita Farahani, who I really am a huge fan of. And she talks about the right to cognitive liberty. That's what she says. And she's got a whole framework around how you do that legally. So for me, there needs to be a sort of a legal enshrining of that. And so between, so I think the days when we believed that a company could simply solve this problem out of the goodness of its leadership's heart is gone, especially as we've seen the pragmatism of some of the people at the very topmost companies drive them to make all kinds of decisions that a past version of them would have been found really objectionable. And as a result, I do think that we're going to need to sort of think about regulation in a new way and not just do what we normally do in the United States, which is regulate against either death or loss of money. We're going to have to regulate around, I know it sounds Orwellian, but regulate around behavior and manipulation in a new way.
So good. That's a good point about the whole manipulation piece, because it keeps coming back as a theme in terms of perhaps one of the deepest seated flaws that humans have, and that is the ability to be manipulated in a way that, you say enough nice things and I'm going to listen to you, and I will start thinking the way you do. And then what you say behind the scenes will now just seep directly into my innermost core, and I will believe that too, whatever that may be. So as we start looking at the technology, where we all have our smartphones, and there's been tons of memes where you show the evolution of man going from the ape all the way up to the standing up straight, and then back to hunching over again as they're looking at their smartphone.
Right.
Exactly.
Yep. Right.
So isn't it ironic that we are now in a quest to be free, that we're now building our own digital prisons within these environments? How do we get past that? Or do we?
I know. Well, I do think that there should be like I say, I think there is a new world we're going to have to consider, in which the choices we make need to be considered not just as a matter of individual initiative, but as a matter of the context in which they were made, and the motivations of the people who built the ecosystem in which they were made. There's a one pattern, that one term that is now a term of art in tech circles, right, is dark patterns. The idea that you can get stuck in these loops in which you can never opt out of a thing, or you sign up for a thing and it never cancels. There is that, I think, in a lot of the way that sort of behavior design works. I've been in some groups in tech circles that actually call themselves behavioral tech groups or behavioral design groups. You have newly minted PhDs, who are experts in addiction, working for companies to make these products as addictive as they could possibly be. I have a podcast called The Rip Current, and one of my guests was a guy named Asa Raskin, who's partners with Tristan Harris in something called the Center for Humane Tech. He's the inventor of the infinite scroll. When you're on Instagram or anything else and you scroll, there's no bottom to the page, and it pauses always with the next bit of the feed just barely visible. So you're always getting the sense that there's more to see. Asa is full of regret about having built that. He estimates that he cost people, he cost humanity billions of years of their lives, essentially, of our collective lives, wasting time with this thing, right? We know that these systems have been built specifically to be manipulative. So we need to do something about that, right? That needs to change. But here's the thing, Michael, that I would say is really also extra complicated with this stuff, is we don't really know what we want, right? This is the other thing. It's like, we are not, you ask two people, what they want, what they think the values of a piece of AI should be. and they're never going to agree, right? You might not even be able to agree with yourself in another time of your life. There's a thought experiment that some of the early researchers at OpenAI once talked to me about, who said that they were this was just like coffee talk, but they were like, the heroin problem is what they called it. They said, you're addicted to heroin, and we've made a perfect AI assistant for you. How should it treat your addiction? Right? Should it be in some way like it's trying to get out in front of your problems and it's trying to help you, make your life smoother? So should it facilitate your addiction? Should it be trying to book your time with your dealer? Is it trying to, is it accommodating how sick you'll be in the mornings because you're junk sick, right? Like, what is it going to know about your addiction, and should it be helping you with that? Or should it be trying to book you time with a detox facility and trying to constantly urge you to get off it, right? Like, I think, it's an incredibly squishy question. Like, what, are people, the idea that we're going to somehow know ahead of time what we want these systems to be for us, and how and what values we want them to reflect is going to be really, really hard. So as much as I'm talking here about like, we need to be more, conscious of how manipulative these systems are, I'm not saying that I think we should pre-program a certain set of values into them so that they aren't manipulative in a certain way. I'm saying I think we may have put the cart way in front of the horse here, in that we shouldn't necessarily be experimenting on each other with how manipulative these systems can be, how effective and persuasive these systems can be, when we don't even know what we want. We're just teenagers, really, as a nation. And so, that to me is the real tough part. Is the like, I know that the whole attitude is ship it, get it out there, and then we'll debug it once it's gone. But I just think this is not a problem that scale is going to solve. I think this is a problem that scale is going to compound.
Like handing out AI cigarettes at the schoolyard? I mean, is this kind of where we're at?
I mean, it's what it is for me is it's like, it's the difference between people who came up in software and people who came up in hardware. People who came up in software believe that if you build and build and build and build, scale will solve your problem because you'll debug over time with more users. I think this is a hardware problem. It's going to compound the problem as you hit scale. Now that suddenly we're about to be awash in AI video slop, that's going to compound the problem of no two people being able to agree on what's true or not in a debate about, the news. So like, I think that we are deepening a difficulty because we are, attaching ourselves to a set of technologies that are going to fundamentally change how we, whether we trust each other, how we behave together, without us having really any idea how we wanted to do that anyway. And so that to me is the crux of it, is that we have a technology now that is pulling us way past what I think we can responsibly decide for ourselves.
So in your book, you mentioned these three concentric loops: the human instincts, tech amplification, societal reinforcement. What's the most provocative way we've already doomed ourselves?
Well, I think that we, the one that really bothers me right now, that I'm especially upset by, is the very permissive attitude we've adopted in the United States toward gambling. Sports gambling on your phone, is now legal in more than half the country. Every time when you go to like a Super Bowl, as a reporter, you'd go to you'd watch these Super Bowl press conferences where the next host mayor will announce they're coming. And, now those press conferences are all about how exciting it'll be to be able to bet. So they'll say sports betting is legal in, Louisiana or whatever it is, wherever it is that's going to be hosted. I really worry about that. I think that there is and that is one of these loops that I'm talking about, where like our ability to become addicted to something like action, is so powerful. I mean, right now there is a whole industry in Russia of what they call sports farms, where you have non-athletes, just regular people, playing sports on camera. And some of these are like they barely count as sports. Like two guys sitting knee to knees in chairs, trying to kick a soccer ball past one another into a goal behind each chair, that kind of thing. And they just stream that 24 hours a day. Why? So people can bet on it, right? If you ask anybody who's a really serious sports gambler, they'll tell you, oh yeah, I don't care about the game. I'm not a fan. I care about the action, right? And action is the thing in our brains that is being taken advantage of there. That the betting on uncertainty is a wired thing. And for some people, it's much more hardwired than it is for others. And we've just sort of taken this attitude in the United States that yeah, it's totally fine to prey on people who have trod that path in the concrete enough that they can't get out of it. And so, and to me, the thing that makes me most crazy, so I'm a former drinker. I quit drinking in 2016. And, what makes me crazy and what makes people I know who are in the sports gambling recovery world crazy is when it says drink responsibly or gamble responsibly, right? Game responsibly, I think they call it. And there's no such thing. There is no such thing as that. That is not how it works for somebody who has a problem with that. Use heroin responsibly is not a thing. And so for me, there's this cavalier attitude we have taken toward one another when it comes to these clearly hardwired decision-making systems that drive the car for us. And somehow we have decided that taking advantage of that for monetary gain is okay in some cases. So that's the one that I think is darkest for me.
Where do you think accountability should lay for things such as that? Because we talk about gambling, there's obviously you go from the base level, you need people to do it. So there's obviously a demand for there's something that's inwired for many people who really glom onto that. Then there's the enablement of it. In other words, we permit it. You mentioned half the states in the United States permit it. It's permitted to happen there, and then it's enabled even further, made easy by the technology. Where does the accountability lie in that government civic kind of way, or are they just looking at the fact that the tax revenue coming from this now kind of outweighs the issues?
I mean, the tax revenue is incredible. And as a result, I think really compromises a lot of people in public service who would otherwise be taking much more strong
follow the money type of thing
about this. Yeah, I mean, there is some of that. I think that, the revenue that, a state gets out of legalizing this stuff is not to be discounted, right? It's an incredible boon to the coffers of a state that needs to figure out how it's going to keep the school buses running, right? So there's definitely a conflict of interest there. One of the things that I would have, like, what I think, as a recovering alcoholic, right? For me, the fact that I can choose whether to physically go into a bar or not is crucial, right? I have to be able to physically choose not to go in there, because what I know from my personal experience and from all of the research is that your brain outsources its decision making to the context it's in, the room you're in. You smell the smoke and you want a cigarette, right? You see the wood paneling of the bar and you want a drink, because your brain says, what do I do in this place? Oh, this is what I do. So the fact that I can remove myself physically from that place means I can make a choice about that. And so for me, that puts some accountability on me, right? If I then choose, I don't think you can, then blame a bar if a recovering alcoholic goes in to drink. I don't think that, maybe that's the world we should live in, but I'm comfortable in my experience with the idea that I can choose whether to engage in that. The booze is right at the checkout stand at Trader Joe's, and so that's there's some squishy stuff here, but for me, not having to go into the bar is good. What I've heard from people who deal with sports gambling, for instance, right, is they say that now that FanDuel and DraftKings are a thing on your phone, they say that for them, carrying a phone with them would be like for me carrying a fifth of whiskey all the time with me, right? They can't physically escape it because they have to have the phone for their life and their work. And so there is something, I think, that is I think you can absolutely. So here's an example. I profiled for NBC once upon a time and talk about it in the book, a whole world called social casino gaming, where it combines all of the most addictive elements of a casino game with social networking and your friends and timed events together and so forth. And it's an incredibly addictive thing for a certain category of person, and it's an enormous industry. And the crazy thing about it costs money to play, but you can't win any real money back. It's the definition of a loser's game. And yet people lose hundreds of thousands of dollars playing these games because they're so compelling to a certain category of person. One of the most compelled categories of people is elderly women. But this is what the makers of these games have figured out, and it's what the social media platforms through which they find these women have helped them figure out. Is here are elderly, lonely women on Facebook. They get these ads and they start to play. And I've interviewed people who lost their life savings to this. This one woman came from a family that had been ruined by gambling, and she moved way the hell out into rural Montana. She's way out past Kalispell, Montana, to a place where you could not, she cannot. It's like me moving way out into the woods so I could get away from bars. And suddenly the bar finds me, right? It comes and gets me. That's for me the difference, I think, between the individual accountability, which I think does have a role here, and the invasive and, I would argue, predatory capacity that technology gives companies that want to do the wrong thing here.
So you brought up a good point in terms of a particular category of people being served ads. And so let's kind of pull on that thread a little bit, because we've seen from a Google perspective, people have their Google histories that are used then to serve specific ads, because obviously you've searched for, whatever you've searched for, and now I'm going to show you ads for something like it, or that category for people who've or organizations who have purchased ads on those keywords. When we start talking about AI and the fact that now there's two parts of this, AI is going to know a lot about us. This whole memory thing is a huge thing. It's a really big targeted aspect for all of the new advances within all of the platforms, is this kind of memory. Hey, Jacob, I know a lot about you. I'm going to continue to remember all of our interactions forever. So I can really get to know you. So when you ask a question, I'll be able to give you the right answer in the right context, the way you want to hear it. But at the same time, now you have this platform that quite literally may know everything about you, because you may have asked it some very personal questions about, I'm not really sure about doing this or this or this. What does this mean? Or I'm struggling with X. To now get ads that may be embedded in those, maybe surreptitiously. Hey, we found people have experienced a lot of help if they tried X product. Where does that stand? Because honestly, when you have OpenAI, while it has revenue coming in, it's still losing billions, right?
Yeah, it's certainly not on a path to make the money back yet. That's right.
Exactly. So going back to the follow the money thing, if that's where the money's at, and there's some real potential to be able to not just zero in, but like hyper personalize ads for folks, do we run risks?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think one of the big things that we're about to face, right, is there's a whole section of my book that's all about anthropomorphism, right? And the brain's desire to attribute more sophistication to a system than it's due. Any system that we don't understand, we just assume God made it magic and it's just doing its thing, like that we should believe what it says. And I think LLMs are the ultimate version of that, right? And I think we're about to, as a result, get into a really scary world in which a voice interaction with a social media kind of assistant, or God forbid, companion, friend,
Mm-hmm.
right? You've got kids using these things as anything from a life coach to a real confidant, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's all super problematic. Well, okay, so then every time you're interacting with that companion, you're firing up all these CPUs in a data center somewhere and you're drawing on all of this training that OpenAI has had to put money into, or any of these big companies has to put money into. So every time you interact, you are creating an incentive. It's not your fault, but you're creating an incentive for them to get the money back. They need to get that money back in some way. So we've already seen, right, that OpenAI has debuted Sora 2, which will generate these little sort of social media style 10-second video clips. They've now said that they'll let adults engage in erotic interactions with the chatbot. Okay, so let's say you have gotten to a place where your entertainment and your romantic and, intimacy needs are being, I wouldn't say filled, but are being addressed in some way by this product. And then that product starts telling you that you should consider, buying this car rather than that car, or, have you thought about what you're going to make for dinner tonight? Or, I mean, these are silly examples, but like, let's now talk about where you get into political messaging, right? And who gets to pay for that? Like, if we're going to enter a world in which this thing is going to somehow pretend to be this neutral friend that your ancient wiring says implicitly trusts because you don't understand how it works, and then it starts, it turns out that its opinions are for sale, then suddenly we're in a very different and scary world. We've already seen a stupid version of that with Grok, with Elon Musk's thing, where it was starting to where it was trying to insert these non sequiturs about white South African farmers in the middle of conversations. People would be asking it like, what's the best recipe for Thanksgiving turkey? And it would be like, well, get the giblets out. And then, did you know that the white boar are being oppressed in South Africa? These random interjections. And the nice thing was we were at a time where you could sort of go, oh, I see what's happening here. That's funny. That's awkward. That's silly. Well, you give them three financial quarters, they'll start to get real subtle, right? That's going to get real subtle. So I think that, again, it's like, are we allowed to, there's this term of art in social media, Mark Zuckerberg pioneered it, called, revealed preferences. That through the behavior on the social media platform, we can reveal your preferences about stuff. And we just sort of like entered a world in which we decided that was totally fair game. And now I think we're coming to a place where suddenly you're going to have those revealed preferences vacuumed up by a system that's better than ever at figuring out what you're into and not. And then hitting you with what sounds like friendly, neutral advice, but can be coming from who knows where, especially when these companies really start to feel the pressure to make their money back.
Yeah, totally understand that. So while we've been burning the house down around us here, you do offer some options on how to reclaim our choices in your book. Can you kind of walk us through that?
Sure. So, I think, we've touched on it several times here, but like this thing of being open with one another about the limits of our own agency, just as humans, is a really important one. And more, so these social casino games that I've been talking about, those companies are beginning to settle in big numbers with class action lawsuits. The plaintiffs are, in essence, winning, or at least scaring these companies enough that they're willing to settle. And that kind of suit gives me hope, because it's showing that courts and juries are starting to say, that isn't right. You shouldn't necessarily be, going after this woman in rural Montana. That doesn't seem right. There are, I think many, many places in which we as a country have been late to the game. It took us 30 years to make gambling a diagnosed malady. But we did it, right? It took 15 years between 1950 and 1965 for big medical studies to turn into big national policy around smoking. We do that, and we are able to do that. And it's a lot slower than how fast these companies sprint, but we can do it. So I like that part of it. The other thing that gives me a lot of hope right now is that I just think kids are always going to save the day. And right now there's this wonderful word going around. So kids, it turns out, are referring to anybody, typically adults, who over rely on AI. Sometimes they'll even talk about the AI chatbot itself in this term, but they call it clanker. Don't be a clanker. And it's this just wonderful derogatory term for people who are leaning too hard into this stuff, And I think that there's something about how kids, are going to look at the generation that's saying, AI everything. And they're going to look at it the way we look at our grandparents who smoked at the dinner table. I think there's something there that I have some hope around. So as long as we keep talking openly about how our brains work and mental health and our vulnerabilities and not pretend that everybody's just their own person and making their own choices, then I think we're going to be okay in the end.
That's very good to know. So if you're looking at these organizations who may be developing AI right now, whether it's OpenAI or even just folks that are in a bank or insurance company somewhere who are now applying some of the same types of chatbots or AI interactions, what kind of advice would you give them as they're adopting this technology?
Well, they're very, very different parties, right? So the folks, the startups who are making the AI products and the big companies that are making the foundational models, they have their own opportunities and their own challenges. I look at those and I think to myself, you can sprint ahead into the unknown, and it is part of the fun and satisfaction of those companies to do that. But there are some places in which you could actually take a little time and say, you know what, how am I going to, like, I'm biased, but this is one of the things I really want these big companies to bring folks like me in to help them do, is to make journalism stronger. Like you're making a product that could conceivably destabilize journalism's role in democracy, or you could make a product that really makes it stronger and makes us all able to say, this is true and this is not, and let's have a debate about what we want to have happen here, which is what journalism is supposed to do. So there's the foundational companies, there's the supply side, right? Then the demand side, the banks, the insurance companies, the health agencies, right, that are looking at deploying this stuff. When I go talk to those companies, and that's the place I really like to go speak, because they are understandably excited about the potential and also frightened about doing it wrong. I get to talk to them about, first of all, like, what is it that, first of all, like, how do we make sure that your values as a company, it's hard to identify our values as individuals, but we can identify some values as a company. What do we want our legacy to be as a company? And then I can give you a true and real audit of whether or not these tools are available for pursuing those kinds of values in a wholly automated way or just in a sort of helpful way. The other thing is the deployment of AI tools across your organization, first of all, has not been shown yet to show much in the way of productivity gains. There was a big MIT Media Lab study that showed that 95% of respondents basically found that in the end, they did not see improvements in productivity. My theory is that in part, that's because the small number of people who use the tools well were offset by all the people who were confused by the tools and wound up wasting days playing around with them, right? But on top of that, the people who implement the tools well and see big productivity gains, we've even seen in them that they're hugely unhappy with the job. It makes them not like the work to basically be a kind of prompt wrangler, And that for me is a complicated thing. So how do you get people to continue to enjoy the work and bring their best version of their creative selves to the work? So that, and one of the ways of doing that is to identify the specific places in which you can give them a chance to implement the right tools to sort of make them a better version of themselves. And if you're going to, in fact, carve some productivity gains out of it, don't just bank those immediately. Instead, put them toward giving those people a little time to be extra creative in a different way. Give them a few hours on a Friday where they get to just screw around, or come up with some new problems they think you should solve, or whatever it is. Like, if we're going to, in theory, free up some time and give people the opportunity to do that. And then the last thing I think that we're really going to have to look at is entry-level jobs are, if we're truly going to automate being a paralegal, right, or being a researcher or being a clerical assistant, and no longer ever hire somebody to do those jobs. Well, okay, how are you then going to find people that are qualified for that third position, that third level position, where you need the soft skills and the people skills and so forth? And so the other thing is, you got to start bringing people in an apprentice capacity as young people, because if you don't, you're going to wind up without anyone qualified to do the work you need to do in that third level and beyond kind of role. And so for me, there's a real framework where you gotta, if you're going to try and, there's this thing called the Jevons paradox. That's a really amazing thing, where this guy William Jevons in the 19th century figured out that even though England had figured out the technology to burn coal much more efficiently, they were somehow running out of coal, and it has since then become this phrase for describing how when we use a thing more efficiently, we just wind up using more of it. And so I think the illusion that a lot of these big companies want to sell is the idea that you're going to somehow retrieve huge amounts of free time from your people. I think instead you're just going to wind up burning all of that time if you do this the wrong way. And so for me, there's something about, being really measured about, how do I keep my best people engaged? How do I train new people to become my best people? And how do I not over promise my shareholders and everybody else what this stuff is going to do? Because, as cool as it is, it's not going to transform your workforce in the way that you would want. Not quite yet.
Not yet, at least. Yeah. Well, Jacob, thank you for all of your insights. This has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you being here to kind of give us some of your insights and go through the pieces of your book for sure, but also to answer some of the questions that just came out of the blue here, because honestly, I think the experience and the touch points that you've had really bring out some questions that need to be answered and that maybe some of the companies aren't necessarily working on yet because they're too enamored by the technology. So I really appreciate you being able to bring those things out.
This has been a really thoughtful conversation, Michael. I really appreciate your questions.
Thanks for listening to Transform Now, the podcast from SS&C Blue Prism. You can find all of our episodes on your favorite podcast channel, as well as YouTube. To stay on top of the hottest topics in the world of agentic automation, subscribe now. The future of work is here.